For years, there was this prevailing idea in decentralized finance, a belief that a decentralized autonomous organization, a DAO, could somehow exist beyond the reach of traditional law. The thinking was that code, not courts, was the final word. But as we're about to see, a series of landmark legal cases has completely turned that idea on its head, creating a much more complicated reality for anyone involved in a DAO. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by taking apart that core myth about DAO immunity. Then we'll get clear on two really important legal ideas, piercing the corporate veil versus default entity status. From there, we'll dive into the two huge cases, Uki DAO and Sarko-Kuni, that changed everything. We'll also look at a really sharp dissenting opinion before we wrap up with what this new reality means for the future of DAOs. All right, let's get right into it. The whole idea of a DAO as a veil is just a fundamental misreading of the law. The real danger for people in a DAO isn't that a regulator is going to try and break through some kind of corporate shield. No, the actual threat, as the courts are making very clear, is that for most DAOs, there was never any shield there in the first place. You see, this whole idea of immunity came from a kind of techno-libertarian view of the world. The theory was, if you make a structure decentralized enough, run it with smart contracts, and spread governance across token holders, well, then it can't be a legal entity that you can sue. The organization would be, in theory, enforcement-proof. It would be like trying to serve a lawsuit to a piece of software. And that brings us to the really critical question that regulators and courts have now answered pretty decisively. Instead of asking how to break through a liability shield, the real question became, what happens when the law looks at a DAO and decides there's no shield at all? Reframing the problem this way is really the key to understanding everything that follows. To really grasp the legal thinking here, we need to draw a sharp line between two very different concepts. First, there's the incredibly high bar of piercing the corporate veil. And second, there's the much lower and, frankly, much more relevant standard for DAOs, default entity classification. Piercing the corporate veil is something the courts do only in really extreme situations. It assumes that a formal legal entity, like a corporation or an LLC, already exists. A plaintiff then has to convince a judge that this legal separation should just be ignored, which is a huge ask. It's usually only granted in pretty clear cases of fraud or serious injustice. And the main thing to understand here is just how hard this is to prove. You have to pass a really tough two-part test. First, you have to show a unity of interest, basically that the company is just an alter ego for its owners, maybe because they're mixing personal and company funds. Second, you have to prove that respecting the corporate shield would lead to a fundamentally unfair result. It's a standard that is intentionally and rightly very difficult to meet. Now, on the complete other side of the spectrum, you have default entity classification. You see, the law doesn't really like a vacuum. If a group of people get together to run a business for profit, but don't bother to formally register it, the law doesn't just see a void. Instead, it assigns a structure to them. And for for-profit groups, that default structure is almost always a general partnership or an unincorporated association. This table really helps to make the distinction crystal clear. When we talk about piercing the corporate veil, we're starting from a place where a liability shield exists, and the goal is to find a reason to remove it. But with general partnerships and unincorporated associations, those default categories, we're starting from the opposite position. There is no inherent liability shield at all. Liability flows directly to the members by default. Okay, let's move from the abstract legal theory to the concrete reality of our first major case study. The enforcement action against Uki DAO set a massive precedent, and it became the perfect test case, really, because its founders almost dared regulators to come after them. So here's how it all went down. It started with a company called B0X, which was running an illegal derivatives platform. When they started feeling regulatory heat, the founders transferred control of the whole thing to a new DAO. And this wasn't some subtle move. It was a very public attempt to become enforcement-proof. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, saw this as a direct challenge they couldn't ignore. And you don't have to guess at their motives. This quote from one of the founders lays out the evasive purpose in plain English. They weren't just decentralizing. They were openly saying that the act of decentralizing made them immune. They basically threw down the gauntlet, and a regulator like the CFTC felt they had no choice but to pick it up. So the CFTC's legal strategy was built on one key argument, that the Uki DAO was an unincorporated association.
But here's the novel and, frankly, game-changing part of their theory. They claimed that anyone who participated in governance by voting their tokens was a member of that association. And as a member, they were personally on the hook for the DAO's violations.
But it wasn't just the government taking action. At the same time, a second legal battle was opening up, this time from private individuals. The case of Sarkononi versus BZX DAO showed that regular people, not just regulators, could use these same kinds of legal arguments to go after DAO participants for damages. The Sarkoony case was born out of a massive hack of the protocol, which led to $55 million in user funds just vanishing. The users who lost their money banded together and filed a class action lawsuit, not just against the founders, but also against anyone they believed was in control, including the DAO's biggest investors. Now, in this case, the plaintiffs used a slightly different, but just as powerful legal theory. They argued that the BZX DAO was, for all intents and purposes, a general partnership. Their claim was that it met the simple three-part test. You have people acting as co-owners of a business for profit. And under partnership law, that means all partners have unlimited personal liability for the business's debts. A ruling in a related case involving the Lido DAO then added a really important layer to all of this. The court drew a line between just passively holding tokens and meaningful participation. For big investors, like BCs, who had publicly advertised that they would lend expertise or be active in governance, the court said it was plausible they could be considered general partners. Suddenly, your own marketing material could become a source of massive legal risk. Now, for a complete picture, it's crucial to understand that the CFTC's decision to go after Oki DAO was not unanimous. One of the commissioners, Summer Mersinger, wrote a very powerful dissent that really lays out the main arguments against the agency's strategy. Commissioner Mersinger's core legal argument was that the CFTC was overstepping its authority. She argued they were essentially making up new law through a single enforcement action instead of using the proper tools given to them by Congress. She called it what it was: regulation by enforcement, creating a huge precedent without any formal process or public input. But her biggest point was about the real-world consequences. This voting equals liability theory, she said, creates a truly perverse incentive. Think about it. Why would any token holder vote to help a DAO become compliant with regulations if the very act of voting could make them personally liable for every mistake the DAO ever made? She warned that this could paralyze governance, turning DAOs into zombies that are unable to fix themselves. So let's pull all of this together. What does this all mean? Well, the Oki and Sarkoony cases have completely rewritten the rules of the game for anyone participating in a DAO. The age of feeling immune is over. Now, everyone has to operate in a world where the legal exposure is very, very real. And perhaps the scariest risk of all is something called joint and several liability. What this means is that a plaintiff doesn't have to divide up the damages among all the guilty parties. No, they can recover 100% of the money from any single member who has deep enough pockets to pay. That person is then left with the nearly impossible task of trying to sue thousands of other anonymous members to get their fair share back. Faced with this kind of existential threat, a pretty straightforward solution has emerged: the legal wrapper. What we're seeing now is many DAOs rushing to set up formal legal entities, things like LLCs or foundations, to put their operations inside. This gives them the corporate veil, that formal liability shield that they were missing before. And this brings us to our final, and I think fascinating question. DAOs were born from an idea of escaping traditional legal systems, of building something new. The great paradox now is that their very survival, their ability to grow and mature, might depend not on escaping the law, but on figuring out how to thoughtfully embrace it. The revolution, it seems, is going to need some lawyers.